and the recording may be. Okay. This meeting of the Economic Development and Employment Committee of Brooklyn Community Board 2 is called to order and is being recorded for public access and archiving in accordance with the New York State Open Meeting Law. It is the practice of CB2 to conduct remote meetings with all committee members' cameras on. Public attendees are also encouraged to leave their cameras on, particularly if you're given the floor to speak. All attendees, please keep your microphone muted when you're not speaking. To maintain appropriate discussion and voting process, I will make it known when and which topics are open for comment by committee members, board members at large, and the general public. If you have a question that falls outside of public comment time, please type your questions in the chat panel and we'll address them as time permits. You may also email the district office anytime outside of these meetings. We are committed to provide access to all of our neighbors, regardless of physical ability or limitations. If you require accommodation or assistance for full participation, please contact the district office 72 hours before any public meeting. Committee secretary will now conduct a roll call.
Hey, everyone. Starting roll call with Chair Bill Flanoy.
Sure.
I see Bill, Vice Chair Denise Peterson. I don't see Denise yet, unless she's dialing in, but I'll keep my eyes open. Catherine Gelman, that's myself, Secretary.
I'm on the phone.
Oh, Denise, I hear you.
Good evening,
No
everybody.
No problem. I see you now.
Okay.
Maisha Morales. Latrell Masso. Celeste Staton. Cyril Scala.
Cyril.
I see you, Cyril.
Mm-hmm.
Kate Yearwood Young. Hey, Kate. Okay, we're set.
Okay, excellent. Okay, I'd like to have an adoption agenda. May I have recommendation for the adoption and a second, please? Okay, Cyril Scala in a second. Okay, Ms. Gilman. Okay, excellent. Thank you. If there's any questions or in regards to the minutes of November 22nd. Okay, thank you, Ms. Gilman. You did an excellent job on them. I hopefully everyone had a chance to read that. If there's any corrections, please email Ms. Gilman. And with that, we're going to move on to a presentation of the New York City Independent Budget Office, the economic impact of newly arrived asylum seekers on the New York City budget. Giving a presentation and then answering questions is George Sweeting, the Acting Director of IBO. Sir, thank you very much for your attendance. I feel honored to see you here.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to speak with you all tonight. I hope I think we'll have an interesting conversation. Just very quickly, IBO, as you probably know, but just for those who may not, is a city agency. We're created in the city charter. The purpose of the agency is to assist everyone involved in the budget process other than the mayor, as well as far as resources allowed, to also handle questions and requests for analysis from members of the public, the media, academic groups, other researchers. So we serve a broad range of clients. I'm not sure, is this? Oh, this is the city org chart. Okay. Can I put my screen up here? Yeah.
Absolutely. Go right ahead.
Okay. Where is it? There we go. Sorry about that. Can you all see that? Last month, IBO released a report estimating the costs associated with newly arrived asylum seekers And this report was undertaken at the request of Staten Island Borough President and a number of council members from Staten Island. I would just note throughout the conversation here, we refer to all the new arrivals as asylum seekers. Although neither IBO nor the city know the immigration status of each one of those people, but just for convenience, I'm going to refer to all of the increase in people coming into the city's various shelter system entry points as asylum seekers. So just a little background. The asylum seekers that we've identified are those coming from the southern border of the United States with Mexico, and they've started to arrive in New York City in April of 2022. In those early arrivals were generally coming on their own. They were not part of the bus caravans that have been organized more lately. And most of them are fleeing economic collapse and political instability, social unrest, particularly in Venezuela, but also in some other countries in Latin America. And there's been a large uptick in these arrivals since late summer, when some of the governors of the states along the border, although also some local governments, including the city of El Paso in particular, started providing transportation directly to New York City for these people. Their argument was New York City claims to be a sanctuary city, has significant resources and programs that it dedicates to homeless individuals, and they claimed that the resources and the services available at the border were not sufficient to deal with all of these people, and so they put them on buses and sent them to a number of northern cities, but New York City in particular. As of mid-November, according to city statistics that we've been provided with, around 23,800 asylum seekers had arrived in the city since April. Although, of course, this number continues to change daily as more arrive. The trends go up and down a little bit, but there's been a steady flow of asylum seekers coming to the city since April, with the acceleration that I noted in the summer when the bus caravans were being organized. So let's see. In terms of the costs that we tried to bring into this analysis, and the very first thing I should say is we absolutely do not claim these are all the costs. These are the costs that it was possible for us to identify in the city spending records, partly because this is sort of an emergency and the city's had to act fast, but also partly just because the tendency of the city to sometimes obscure where funding is in the budget or what the funding is being used for. We certainly don't claim to have tracked down every dollar that's been spent. So in terms of the areas that we were able to gather sufficient information to have some useful comments. The first are shelter services. These are homeless shelters that are operated by the Department of Homeless Services, DHS, and also these humanitarian emergency response and relief centers, or HERCs, were developed by not DHS, but by the New York City Emergency Management Department, NYSEM. And the most, the HERC that most people have heard about was the tent structure that was erected on Randall's Island. That's actually been closed, And the city continues to operate HERCs outside of the DHS domain, but they now are being run out of hotels in the city. We also were able to isolate some costs in the Department of Education, in the delivery of health services, immigration legal assistance, and there's a handful of other relatively small costs that we were able to identify. But as I said, there's no doubt where we don't have the full picture here. Wherever possible, we calculated a per person or per household cost. And the reason we did this is that the estimates can then be scaled up as the number of asylum seekers and the levels of service that are being provided. It gives you the possibility of estimating, if the number of asylum seekers goes from 28,000 to 35,000, you could take that increase of 7,000 and multiply it times these per person rates in order to get some sense of what the spending is like at a higher level or a different level. So we were able to do that on many, but not all of these items. So let me start with shelter, which is the largest of the costs here, and really the one that drives the whole estimate. As I said, the city has two different types of shelters that it's operating for these people. There are the traditional homeless shelters, and then these HERCs that they've developed. And in order to get at the cost here, we used our standard methodology for looking at the annual cost of housing one homeless person or in a DHS shelter. It does vary by the type of household. Our estimate is it's $50,000 for an individual, $50,000 a year. For families with young children, it's $69,000, and for families with related adults, so that's usually just a couple, is $63,000. If you then take the number of asylum seekers that are in shelter, and here we assume that the cost of providing shelter in a HERC is the same as the cost of providing shelter in a traditional DHS shelter, especially now that they're operating out of hotels, which is a significant part of the DHS inventory of shelters. If you do the multiplication out there, we come to an estimated cost of about $487,000. I'm sorry, I wish it was that, $487 million for providing shelter to. This was the number of asylum seekers that were in the city in October. And of course, the city has to do this because, unlike many other cities, New York is legally required to provide shelter to individuals who otherwise would be homeless. Many of the asylum seekers that are arriving in New York have no existing ties to the city. So it's not like they're getting here and they might need a little sort of guidance on how to get around, but they've got someone, they've got family or friends that they can connect with. It doesn't seem that's true in many cases for these the people that have been arriving, particularly in these buses. So if you're an asylum seeker arriving in New York City by whatever means or for whatever reason, and you don't have a place to live, you are entitled to draw shelter services from DHS or one of these HERCs. The costs do include housing and meals, but and some other services such as case management. But really the largest cost is just running the shelters themselves and providing a bed in them. We expect that these costs are going to be largely paid with city funds. There is some state and federal funding that goes into the shelter system, but particularly in the case of these types of households, it's most likely that it will be city funds that have to pay for it. Switching to education. Here, what we did was look at the Department of Education uses something called the Fair Student Funding Formula, which is it's a per student amount of money that a school gets, and the particular amount that a school gets for a particular student is dependent on the needs and any particular needed service for the student. Are they a special education student? Are they ELL student? Are they homeless? There's actually there's some additional funding there. So we looked at at the end of October there were 5,850 students from asylum-seeking families that had been enrolled in public schools, and that's a pretty good. The Department of Ed has a pretty good count on that. So if you take the Fair Student Funding formula that the city uses, and you're increasing the enrollment by that 5,850, each per pupil, the per pupil amount is around $6,200. That's for the base, plus also it's assuming that all of them are going to be English language learners and therefore would get the normal allocation of almost $2,000 for because of the additional costs of providing services to ELL students. That's a mix of state and city funds. So you've got $6,240 for each student, and then the city also, in an attempt to help provide additional services in these schools that are affected by new enrollees, the city allocated $12 million, or it's roughly $2,000 per student. For students that's going to the school. It goes to the school budget, not to the student or the student's family. But the school gets an additional $2,000 per student for these asylum-seeking families. If you do the multiplication all the way through, it comes to a cost of about $48 million. For these additional education costs that have emerged because of the higher enrollment and this additional $2,000 per student funding that the city has allocated.
Mr. Chair, can I interrupt for a second? Would it be
No,
better
Cheryl,
if we could separate this? It's a lot to digest.
I would rather him complete this presentation, then we'll ask questions.
Okay.
Yeah, continue.
So there are a few other areas of spending in the education area, although these it's not clear yet whether the city has actually incurred any additional expenses in this area. For shelter-based family assistance, for shelter, there's funding for shelter-based family assistance navigators. And these are people who are supposed to help a family get the students enrolled in a appropriate school, presumably near the shelter, and help these families as they begin to deal with the bureaucracy of the Department of Education, and arrange for transportation, for the student to get to the school, There's all kinds of various applications and programs that are available. And the city has been providing these, particularly in targeting these services to families in shelters for a number of years now. In fact, in the current fiscal year, the city has budgeted $33 million for those positions. What's not clear is if the demand for services, because there are these additional families in the shelters, if that will become large enough that the city will need to increase its budget to continue providing these services at roughly the same level. For the moment, we're assuming they will not do that, and it's not included in our estimate of the cost of the increase in asylum seekers. There's also some health or medical costs that are being incurred, although none of these are likely to hit the city budget directly. We assume that, it's not an assumption. We were told that every individual coming into the system is being given a COVID test and COVID vaccine. These are the costs that that H+A Health and Hospitals Corporation incurs in delivering those services. It's $120 per person and for the test, and $150 for the vaccine. The federal government is currently reimbursing H+H for delivering those services to not just asylum seekers, but anyone. So that should not result in a cost to the city, but it's a cost. It is an increase in spending just by at H+H, with a federal reimbursement. There's also some basic health care that these asylum seekers have been promised. Using Medicaid data, we estimate that that's about $1,500 per year. That may seem low, but that's it's the idea is this is very basic medical care that is being committed here, so that it doesn't amount to that large a number, about $35 million. And again, because the city's Medicaid spending is subject to a cap, even if total Medicaid spending goes up, New York City's piece of it doesn't. The state's piece goes up, and the federal government's piece goes up, but our piece stays the same. So we're, in terms of the city budget, we're protected from an impact there. Another area that we know there will be spending, and this is one where we think it's quite likely that the costs are going to be higher than what we've estimated here, is legal services. So the city early back in the summer posted an RFP, a request for proposals, to deliver services that they called light touch legal services, which would be sort of basic, know your rights and know where, how to fill out some of the paperwork in order to begin the process of being granted asylum here. It's not legal representation in court. It's basic. It's really basic stuff. The city actually got a fair amount of pushback for the argument was sort of, it's not worth incurring these costs because you're delivering such a small, the quantity of the service that's being delivered is just it won't get these families very far. So they actually pulled the RFP. So that contract was not awarded. But the budget allocation for almost $22.4 million is still there. It's just the the RFP was pulled and the contract was not awarded. The city also, before the asylum seeker issue really emerged back in the spring, had already included $14 million in the budget for legal defense services, but that's limited to deportation cases. So that continues to be there, and it could be a source of funding for services for the asylum seekers, but at the moment it has not been reallocated. The city sort of traditionally pays about $2,600 per case for an immigration case, for representation in a immigration case, and the excuse me, advocates and nonprofit providers of these legal services estimate that these cases you're looking at costs of at least $3,200, probably more, per case, and that's that's one reason why I started out by saying it's quite likely that legal services is going to consume much more money than has been allocated so far. There are also a few areas where there are some sort of fixed costs that the city has absorbed. These are not I said before that we tried to produce per capita estimates. These we don't have per capita estimates. They're really just fixed single costs. First of all, the city appears to be using existing contracts to cover asylum seeker services. The city already, for example, in emergency management, has sort of open contracts for that they can tap when when an emergency exists or emergency occurs. And also, if there's a declared emergency, they can also bypass some of the standard contracting rules and procurement rules. So there are some fixed costs that IBO has identified that are being treated, were contracted through these processes. There was $650,000 to move and set up the HERC temporarily on Randall's Island. Of course, that's now been dismantled. There's also $6.75 million for a contract to operate what they call a navigation resource center, which in the delivery of services, that comes even before that's sort of the people meeting the seekers as they get off the bus and providing very, very quick guidance on, generally moving them towards either shelter directly or to one of these HERCs, where they then spend a few days getting things sorted out. There's also $8.2 million that was contracted for language translation services. That's to assist in the delivery of services to these individuals who, for the most part, don't speak English. I would also note that there appear to be many community-based organizations and charities, mutual aid groups that have incurred significant costs for providing clothing and toiletries, school supplies, cell phones, those types of expenses to these families. And it's not clear if the city intends to reimburse these groups for that work, but it certainly, by having these private sector people do this work, that's saving the city money. And that could be an area where there's a change. So, having talked about some of the costs that have been incurred, most of them by the city, but not all of them, we took a look at some potential for paying for this. And we started by looking at whether it was possible to tap federal FEMA, that's Federal Emergency Management Agency, funding to use to deal with this this emergency. So there's the short answer is it's not, it doesn't look very good for FEMA aid for this particular situation. FEMA does have a program called the Emergency Food and Shelter Program, but it's all of $150 million for the entire country. And it's a competitive grant to tap into that 150 million. 150 million, as we saw from the numbers I put up earlier, doesn't go very far in the city. So it's unlikely that that's really going to be a resource. And then there's also the FEMA Public Assistance Fund. But first, the Biden administration would have to issue an emergency declaration for the city. And then even after that, then any grant over $5 million requires congressional authorization. It's not a law, but there's a requirement that the Congress be involved in approving that spending. Just politically, it's unlikely that since the Biden administration has rejected the calls for an emergency declaration at the border. I'm not a politician, but I'll venture a little bit here. I mean, it seems unlikely that the politics in Washington would tolerate an outcome where the city, New York City, was declared an emergency because of these asylum seekers, and was able to draw down significant federal dollars without also doing the same thing at some of the counties along the southern border, particularly in Arizona and Texas. So we assume that it's unlikely that the city is going to be able to tap significant federal dollars through FEMA. The city in its budget does have some reserve funds of its own that it could tap, and this might be where they have to go. The current 2023 budget actually includes a general reserve of about $1.5 billion and a capital stabilization reserve of about $250 million. And the funds in these reserves are intended to deal with unexpected expenses or to make up for lower than anticipated tax revenue in the current year. So certainly these are unexpected expenses that have occurred. The flip side is that the city really counts on that money not being drawn down in any particular year and rolled forward into the next year. And if you exhaust it in one year, you then create a problem in the future year. But it would certainly be the easiest way of bringing additional dollars, making additional dollars available to spend on these families. The city also does have this is new, just in the last couple of years, a rainy day fund. They call it the Revenue Stabilization Fund. It currently has about $2 billion in it, and the city is allowed to draw down 50% of the balance in a given transaction, and they can actually draw down even more if the mayor declares an emergency. But again, this that would be available, but it would drain a resource that the city has available, sort of counts on helping to stabilize the budget in future years. And then the city also has used something called the Retiree Health Benefits Trust Fund as a de facto rainy day fund. And that currently, the way it's set up, there's around $2 billion in that fund that could be drawn out and used to help address these costs. So the timing and the scale of this crisis is still definitely playing out. The biggest open question is the cost for the city in terms of the biggest question for the city is just how many and the timing of the arrival of these asylum seekers here. The southern border right now is largely closed. It was at least for asylum, for people seeking asylum, under an immigration policy that was known as Title 42. So under Title 42, what it says is you have to wait outside the country while your asylum petition is being processed, and so that has resulted in a significant decrease in the number of families arriving in the city. But that policy will be reversed in late December. That'll effectively reopening the border, and so we expect that potentially will bring the flow of people to New York back up to the levels it was in the late summer, early fall, and those would be costs that the city would have to deal with in subsequent fiscal years. So I think that's our whole story. It's the city, because of its policies, is meeting its obligations under those policies for the most part. I mean, there've been some rough edges, but for the most part is delivering the services that it's required to do, and at the moment is largely absorbing those costs, and those costs look to be. I know the administration has thrown around a number of about $1 billion. If you total ours all up, it comes to something around $700 million for a year. And each year as you go forward, it would go higher. So I'd be interested in discussing any of this or taking your questions. I'm not sure of your process.
Director Sweeting, thank you so much. That was a lot of information for us. And it actually answers a lot of questions, but I'm sure we still have additional questions.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Scala, you had your hand raised earlier and you've been very patient, so I'll let you have the opportunity to ask the first question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just, it was a wonderful presentation, very, very interesting and enlightening. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
My only question, I was just wondering, you brought up the subject of these costs that the city will accrue. I was just wondering, it may not be, I don't know how I could ask the question, but we have homeless people in the city who live in the city. I was just wondering how that expense relates to the expense of the new asylum seekers. I'm not even sure that's even something you guys even look at, but I was just wondering, is this, are these more costs, additional costs? I mean, or they are similar to our type of costs for homeless shelters, education, and things like that? I don't know if that is an equation, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. The costs we presented are new costs to the city for this new population, in a sense. These are new residents in the city who are getting basically the same services that that the existing homeless population, or the families that are living in shelters are getting. The city, before, if you look back about a year ago, the city was spending somewhere in the range, don't quote me on this exactly, but of $2.5 billion on homeless shelters. And, our estimate is that that piece of these costs are, based on the number of people that have arrived through the middle of November, is about 650 million, of which the city piece is about 500 million, the city cost. So this is on top of that 2.5 billion that you were spending before this wave of people started to flow in. And that's similar to the education piece. All we did was take the number of kids that have enrolled in the city schools from this group and calculated what it's going to mean in terms of the per student fair student funding allocation that each student brings to their school's budget. So again, that's it's the same service, the same expense anyway, that a family that has been a long time resident would get.
Thank you.
Director Sweeting, when these individuals come in for asylum and they're looking for shelter, I've noticed that we've opened up 4 new shelters and we're now using hotels. How are they actually distributed and what's the process of doing that? Especially if they have family and children.
Distributed in what sense? I'm sorry.
When we place them in different locations.
I think the way they're placing them, it is largely driven by where there might be space, slots open on a particular evening or a particular day. The city operates different types of shelters. There are shelters for individuals, which are sort of generally, they're congregate in many cases. And then there are shelters for families with or without children, which can be either hotels or, small apartment type arrangements. So they're, they are distributing, as they come in, they're being distributed into, the appropriate shelter type for their household type and where there is space available. They have these HERCs that I've mentioned, which are beginning to look more like full-time shelter, regular shelters. They were originally set up to be sort of places to get, for a family to get, just get settled after a couple of days of, being on a bus and rushed up. But they are beginning to look more like long-term shelters. They're operating in hotels, basically the same kinds of hotels and motels that the city uses for homeless shelters.
I was curious about the children themselves. When the children come in and they have to go to school,
right?
And you have different age groups, so forth and so on, and capacity for the schools. How is that being accommodated when you have children coming in to these shelters and then they have to go to school? How do they get to school? What schools are they being, especially if you're not speaking? Well, sir.
Yeah. First of all, I mentioned that the city had these positions that were already existed to the shelter navigation system, the navigation service providers, and there's another category that their job is to help the families get integrated with the DOE, and that involves finding a school hopefully nearby the shelter, or there's some integration between the shelter operators and the DOE people, and at the shelter location that can help move families around, to maybe hopefully to a shelter closer to the school that their children wind up in. It's sort of an open process. and it can involve multiple moves as they try to get the family set up as well as they can in the right kind of place. There are transportation services that the DOE provides to shelter residents to bring them to a nearby school. But we've not gone out and observed exactly how the shelters function. But I can't imagine that it's a process that always works smoothly the first time for a family. I think there are a number of moves that take place in many cases before a family settles down in one particular place.
I understand. My concern is in some cases, my understanding that it could take up to 19 months for a family to finally get settled.
Well, I mean, 19 months might be that's the length. I mean, there are some lengths of stay that are that long in shelters. So I mean, there are families that are in for 500 days or longer that are, they're looking for permanent housing or more permanent housing than they had. But during that time, they're in the shelter and using those services. The other thing I would mention is just one of the issues in the school budget debates last summer, and there was a court case and people trying to force the city to spend it at the level that they had spent last year. But that was prompted by, at least in part, by the fact that enrollment has gone down in the public schools. So there's actually, public schools have more space right now to accommodate new students than they would have, say, 5 years ago. So I think that's actually helped, that's helped make this go a little smoother, probably, in that you do have space in not every school, but certainly in some schools. And that also helps the school if you bring if student enrollment goes up at the school, it brings in this additional money from the Fair Student Funding Formula. And it just makes the school, a more lively place if it's, if you've got more seats filled. So, that's one thing that's, if you had to have this situation, on the school front, it's not a bad time to have it.
Yes, as a matter of fact, I was just about to bring up the next question, which just came up in the chat by Taya, which was, you have a lot of individuals who are coming in from Venezuela and they're speaking Spanish. How are we accommodating these individuals as far as the children within the schools? Because they're going to need translators.
Right. Well, first of all, one of the contracts we were able to find in the city spending records was a contract for translation services. Now, I personally don't know if $8 million is enough to meet the need. It wouldn't surprise me if it wasn't large enough. But anyway, so that's been put in place, and I believe that they're being used primarily at the HERCs and these navigation centers, to help get these people, at least somewhat oriented to, they're in a completely different place. Most people not speaking their language. They, probably most of them have very little, if any, experience with New York City. So those navigation centers and those sort of reception centers, if they're functioning well, play a really critical role. And I think that's where much of the translation services are being delivered. At the schools, New York City schools have a fair amount of experience teaching English as a new language. The amount of the dollars that we identified as being an increased cost at the DOE, include, we made the assumption that every one of these students would be an English language learner. It's not 100% accurate, but that, for the purposes of estimating. And so we included when the city identifies an ELL student, it increases the allocation to the school to help that school, that particular school, provide the additional services that are needed for that student. That amount, I think, is $1,850 per student.
Okay. Ms. Morales, I saw you have your hand raised, and we'll allow some of the other committee members an opportunity to speak.
Sure. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for your presentation. It was great. It was thorough. I guess my question is, given the current state of affairs, we have a housing crisis in New York City. Our schools, our public schools are being defunded. What is the city actually doing to address, are they even, the current crisis of New York City residents in these shelter systems, and some just facing housing insecurity? So they may not be in a shelter system yet, but they're a paycheck away from being there. And I would also say that with the fair student funding model that they use, some would actually say that the formula needs to be increased, the monies. And so having now asylum seekers here, us having to shelter them as well, thinking about the impact it will already have in our very fragile system. What is if the city is doing anything to address the current homeless crisis and defunding of the schools? Well,
the school funding issue has my office actually participated in a task force that was reviewing the way the fair student funding process works for the city, or doesn't work. And one of the interesting things, our contributions there was to take, when the city looked at changes to the formula, but assumed you wouldn't bring any additional dollars in, you would just rearrange the dollars. And we ran a number of versions of potential changes to that system, where you start out by bringing in additional dollars to allocate. So, and you do get different results when you bring in more money, and it certainly would have an impact, a positive. It would increase the school budgets in a way that's presumably useful. In terms of the housing, I mean, that's an ongoing problem that the city does have its approaches there. There's going to be a big debate about whether we need to renew the 421A housing property tax exemption. Some people argue that's going to be the only way you generate, you can bring the cost down sufficiently that developers will build affordable housing. Other people think it's, what we're spending there is way too much already. I suspect, though, that there's going to be a big push to do something on the tax exemption side for the property tax, and the concern being, the need for additional housing, additional affordable housing. That's probably problem number one for New York City.
Director Sweeting, as a matter of fact, that is one of the biggest issues that we're dealing with in our district. Is truly affordable housing, not affordable housing that's at the AMI of $160,000 a
Right.
year.
Yep.
Our borough, basically, the average income for a family of four is around $50,000 or $60,000. They can't afford these rents.
Yep.
Yeah. Ms. Gilman,
So much to think on here. Really appreciate your time, Director Sweeney.
Thank you.
I wanted to echo what Maisha had just said. Thinking about this, and you know this deeply from your work over the years, looking at a bird's eye view of the city, but us already being in crisis, and how we can try to shift our governance from a less reactionary, sense of like there's already refugee status for so many New Yorkers, in the sense of not being able to live up to the mandate of having fair of having shelter provided. So the sense of hoping that with crisis can come opportunity, like you're saying, to think about school budgets or ways that we could try to really take what is like a breaking point and turn it into better support all the way around for New Yorkers and these new asylum seekers. So it's just one thought that's coming to mind, and in being in a state of emergency with this. And I'm curious, with your research, if you've seen other cities and any examples of kind of, I know you're an apolitical organization, which I really appreciate, but how they've approached this, or if New York is really the front wave on this and kind of leading nationally in strategy. We obviously have a new mayor, and we're looking at, the 8 different kind of sites that he's proposed, with the mix of CBOs and people hoping for probably for public-private partnership, even within shelter sponsorship, or ideas that are floating around. But I'm curious if there's anything we should look to as we kind of make noise about this at a more local level. And even of note, when you're talking about tax exemptions and thinking about property, and considering that so much of the refugee crisis comes from political instability, economic instability, things like global, drug trade and impact of the war on drugs. We're looking at a new cannabis industry in New York. Is there, like, what kind of thoughts are we having at a bigger level here with how to deal with a problem that's not going anywhere?
There's a lot there.
Yeah, I know a bunch in there, but whatever.
I mean, one point I would start out by making is the one thing that makes New York very different in the context of dealing with asylum seekers or even just refugees or migrants is we operate under legal requirements to provide shelter. Most places don't have anything like that. So, that's a cost the city has accepted over the decades. It goes back to court decisions, I think, in the 1980s. But it certainly comes at the price of a major piece of the city budget each year. It's in the billions of dollars that the city spends on shelters, and of course, I read out the per year average cost of keeping someone in shelter. For a family, it's I think $69,000 per year, and even for an individual, it's $50,000. The people are entitled to housing. That's a pretty expensive way to deliver it. Through relying on a shelter, relying on people to become homeless and then wind up in the shelters, and then we spend $50,000. I think at the moment there isn't that much focus on that question, and that's certainly something that I think if more people talked about it in those terms, it might be a way of changing the conversation a bit.
Yeah, just to jump in with you in response, I think when I'm listening to you speak, even thinking about the issue of houselessness in New York, generally, just by our own experience over the years, if this crisis can create enough political pressure on what is already should have been moved through in a less bureaucratic way by the city of New York. Like there are ways that the people have been circling this question on affordable housing and how incredibly expensive our shelter response systems are.
Mhm.
And like what opportunity does this bring? Is there any kind of call that you guys are receiving to do, side by side studies of our development plans in the city over the next couple of years as it relates to affordable housing, the trend in these numbers, with global instability increasing for a bunch of reasons. Like if we can press this forward and say, if housing is the one thing we can control here, like how can we show the numbers for just how expensive this is going to continue to be
Right.
to keep our current strategy? I know it's a big round kind of question, but I think at a local level, everyone feels at a loss because development is piece by piece and administration by administration, and the questions here are so big, and the budgets just aren't there to meet them.
Right. I mean, one issue that comes up sometimes is the way our property tax system tends to deliver some of the lowest tax burdens to homeowners and apartment owners, and leaves a pretty, a heavier tax burden on rental properties. Now, of course, tenants don't pay the property tax directly, but tenants do pay a piece of the landlord's property tax through their rent. And one way of perhaps facilitating more development of, if not super affordable, more affordable than some of what's being done, is if you lowered the cost, the property tax cost on those properties. And that's that would benefit both the landlords, but it would also benefit the tenants. At least if you had a mechanism to make sure that the lower lower property tax was passed through in the form of a lower rent. You could do it as some kind of circuit breaker with the state income tax. That's done in other cities and other localities. Property tax reform is kind of a that's a really big subject that gets it generates a lot of heat. But there are disparities in that system that wind up burdening rental property more than homeowner property. And since more than 60% of the city's population are tenants rather than owners, there's the possibility of coming at it that direction. I think it's going to be very important for people to watch what happens in Albany this year with with the 421A extension or replacement. They started to do that last year and backed off. And at the moment, there is no 421A. It's expired. But there's going to be a lot of pressure to put something back. But also, as that's going on, there might be ways of also extracting, changes to the process that would allow for deeper subsidy, more affordable units than certainly than the program has been able to create up until now.
Ms. Yearwood Young, you had your hand raised.
Hi, apologies for the background noise of the kids. I did have my hand raised. I think we sort of addressed it was really more of a comment, or I guess the question about just the sheer cost of housing someone in a congregate shelter for individuals when you could be spending, $4,000 a month on rent and food for that person and have $2,000 left over every year is a little shocking, and I understand it's not quite that simple. There's processing, there's, as we talked about, placing people, but I guess, that you sort of covered a little of this, but how do we kind of get that? I mean, and for a family at $69,000 a year, again, it's like you could spend, $4,000 on rent, $1,500 a month on food, and again, still have leftovers. So it's just, and then for people in the situations they're in terms of these shelters where many would rather be on the street than, be in a congregate shelter. It's just, I don't know, it's just like how do we just do better by people, especially when spending these amounts? I know that's not, I feel bad, I think it's not your job to figure that out or a question, but I'm curious if there's any thoughts of, as Kate already kind of alluded to, like overhauling, just like how we do this.
That's, I would have to go back and spend some time really understanding how the system worked, why it is that it costs that much today. Before I'd want to go too far in making suggestions. It's not something the particular reasons why those are so expensive to operate are things I haven't studied yet.
Yeah, no, fair enough, and I'm sure it's like quite complicated, but thank you.
There's just to jump in with you. Is this okay, Bill? Just a very fast.
No one has their hand raised. Come.
Okay, Kate. I feel like we're circling the same idea of like, how can this crisis just break open what has been a politically an issue that just has not, even though it's the most important to New Yorkers, has just not been able to move, which is affordable housing, and with that, how we operate DHS and all our houseless kind of pipelines. And I know there's a lot of interesting work, Director Sweeting, that's going on right now with local like nonprofit and CBOs that are young, that are looking at this and had put a lot of effort into this mayoral race, trying to talk to those candidates. And I have no idea with Mayor Adams kind of where he sits on this right now, but I think the sense that there's pretty wide consensus that our current system is not effective or efficient on a number of markers, especially economic, but certainly humanitarian.
Mm-hmm.
And the sense of like renewing appetite for this, the need for solution here, and saying like tracking those number of days, tracking the cost per person against our rent, against the amount of city-owned land that can be used for affordable housing that isn't developed, against the kind of mandates on developers that we have. I think to whatever, I know this is, you're talking to us about asylum, but I think what I would press back and hope is that we can be in whatever conversation with you is helpful. But as you research this, that I know there are people, I did an installation this past year with Prescription Home, which was one of the groups, and we did an experiential walkthrough of the what it feels like to move through housing insecurity, and the number of days, the amount of paperwork, the amount of stress that ripples out from that experience on families, what it does to them, and the kind of ceiling of poverty that once you're within our DHS system that it keeps you in, because you can't then earn out of it, or you lose your housing. There's all kinds of bad incentives, and we really need to not have people get into this funnel in the first place. So I'm curious, just with the depth and breadth of your research and work, as you think about, as people are really yelling to deal with this asylum problem, if your office is also moving through affordable housing and DHS in the kind of apolitical way that you're able to sit in it, that we would give you whatever help and backing we can, certainly as a local group, and lend energy towards it. But it's and Taya can attest to this, I'm sure, but the number one thing that everyone feels and hears about in our district, and likely in every single district in New York.
Yeah. You know, we do have a housing group that's beginning to look at some of these questions. You know, and you know, I would love to put them in touch with some of the groups you're talking about, and there's probably you know, some information that could go both ways that would help on that. You know, we could set something like that up.
Yeah, be happy to.
Okay.
Yes, Director Sweeting, that would be something that we would definitely want to follow up with you. I'm going to ask you another question, sir, back to asylum seekers. Let's get us back on topic. One of the things I'm looking at right now is, okay, you have these individuals who may be in New York City for quite some time. Is there anything they can do as far as work permits or anything along the lines of, you know, things along those lines? What can we do about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the, you know, I was surprised at this when we dug into this, and we found out that it takes on average 5 to 6 months for an asylum seeker to be legally authorized to work in the US. And that just seems so counter, you know, that's counter to what you would want. I mean, if you've got individuals who are here, who are, you know, able and willing to work, and they can't do it legally, you know, now I'm sure in some cases they're doing informal things, but then they're subject to, you know, all kinds of exploitation, and you know, they're operating without, you know, without legal protection on, you know, having their wages paid fairly, and, you know, a whole range of potential abuses that are there if you're outside the legal work system. I guess it has to do with, you know, an assumption that they want to, that there's just paperwork that has to get done to certify that you're at least a candidate for asylum. I mean, one of the other things we learned is that only about 20% of the people who apply for asylum seemingly actually qualify at the end, and, you know, that the end of that can be a couple years out from when you get here. So, you know, something's on work permits and regulations. I don't usually make policy recommendations, but that seems just so self-evident that you got, you know, there's got to be a way to authorize people to go to work earlier, you know, faster than 5 or 6 months, because then they're sitting there. You could maybe get them out of the shelter. I mean, if they could actually, you know, in some cases that, you know, they're, you know, I get the sense that particularly at least in this current flow of people from Venezuela, you've got, you know, there's a mix in there of some people that are you know, have job skills that the market would demand. And if you could find a way to let them start using them, earning money, and then maybe they don't even have to be in the shelter. Seems like a pretty straightforward case to make.
Yes, that's why I brought that up, Director. I mean, let's face some facts. If you can actually have a person earn a living so they don't have to live in a shelter at the cost it incurs to the city, it would make sense to allow them to actually do that and then get out of the shelter system and become a viable income earner.
Yep.
Okay, as opposed to a person who's sitting basically using city resources
Mhm.
rather than paying into the city.
Yep.
Right, to taxes.
Yep.
And the other thing that I'm looking at, Director, is the fact that these children, these individuals are all going to be suffering from emotional, pressure and strain. Okay, what are we doing for the children along these lines?
Yeah, we actually tried to pin down, and we weren't successful. But the Department of Education has, for example, has social workers and psychologists at schools. Many would argue that there are not nearly enough of them, or they're not well distributed. But I'll leave that aside. Excuse me, one second. That's going to go away in a second. So we were looking to see had they increased their spending on that at the DOE. We couldn't find evidence that they had or that they had. But that's one of the pieces we're looking at. But yes, absolutely. There have to be increased. The incidence of mental health problems is, given what these kids have been through, or what I think they've been through, suggest that that there's going to be a need for those types of services. As I said, we couldn't find evidence one way or the other of whether they've increased them or not. But the city does have, the DOE does have some in place even before this particular crisis emerged.
Hi.
Understood. Ms. Mosley, you seem like, yes, go ahead.
Hi. I guess, I'm sorry, I was a few minutes late, so I don't know, was this touched on, but not only for social workers and psychologists in the school, what about ESL? For a lot of the students that come in, they, English is their second language. So we need, about help and support in ESL teachers, not only social workers and counselors,
Mhm.
but also ESL to help benefit them, because right now, in the Board of Ed, there's a strain on services already. So, this is going to add to it. So what about help increase the services for these families that come in? Do they need the extra support?
They may very, it's certainly some of them are going to, I would agree with you, are going to need that. And, as I said, we're looking to see, what changes the city makes in the set of services they deliver to the individual schools, or the funding anyway that they deliver to the schools, in order to let them hire on different people with different qualifications. It's a place you would expect the city will make those investments. It may take a while, but we already know that the city did put some extra dollars into it. It's basically $2,000 a kid into the school budget for schools that have asylum seeking kids from asylum seeking families. So there was that the $2,000 doesn't necessarily go that far, but it's it was an increase in the allocation to the schools that were absorbing these kids.
So it was $2,000 per child?
Yes. It's not, the money doesn't go to the student, it goes to the
That's
to the
budget.
school. Yeah.
Director, I want to ask you another question.
Okay. I'm going to have to leave after that one. I'm sorry for that.
Oh, that's no problem. I understand, and thank you very much for your time. This last question is in regards to the legal services. A lot of these asylum seekers are coming in from other states where they've begun the process of requesting asylum, and now they're being moved to New York City. And because of the light legal touch we have, and the fact that there's no RFP in place to actually distribute the funds, how are these individuals dealing with the situation of actually doing the paperwork for asylum if there's no actual legal funds available to them?
You know, the city already does have some spending that it does already for immigration cases, although mostly those are around deportations. But, you know, that's already in the city budget, and probably some of that could be tapped for these families. But yeah, I mean, that's why I said, you know, the legal services is one area where, you know, it would be very surprising if they didn't wind up with having to spend much more money there, because if these people are going to need, you know, it's a long, complicated process to get to actually win asylum status, and you know, there's going to be a need for legal services there.
Okay. Thank you very much, Director Sweeting. I do appreciate your time and the information you've given us. I would like to invite you back for the other issues that we brought up to, if you have the opportunity, or can have someone from your office come. I greatly appreciate that.
We're very interested in continuing the conversations. So.
Okay. Thank you, Director.
All right. Take care, everybody.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Good night.
Good night. Okay, so we will continue with the agenda. Director, well, he just left. Okay, perfect. I was going to ask him if he wanted to, he could stay, but obviously he has someplace else to go, which is totally understandable. Okay, next on the agenda is the chairperson's report. What I'm looking at right now basically is I want to see the agenda for the next couple months, starting in January. Currently right now, the board office looks like it's going to start getting staffed. And that's something that I was been waiting for staffing at the board office. So hopefully that'll go forward. When that actually starts to occur, what I want to start doing is moving forward with our agenda. The agenda has been not as aggressive as I would like it to be. And I mentioned that earlier, that I was hoping that we could just start aggressively in September. But for right now, we're taking it at a slow pace. But come January, I'd like to start to aggressively look at our agenda going forward. Looking at the job training aspect of it. I also want to look at the piece that we've actually just brought up, which is the housing. Even though it's not part of our committee, okay, I think that the fact that some of these points have been brought up in our committee might be something we can pass on to land use. Yes, Kate, I see your hand raised.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I didn't know what the executive committee, if this had been discussed by Lenny or by you all. I know affordable housing has been floated as like a missing committee, given its importance in the district and not having its own designation. Do you think that's something that economic development needs to take up, or
are they kind of looking to put that somewhere?
You know what? There's been no discussion about that. So until there's discussion about that, it's just something that right now is in the purview of land use.
Okay.
Okay. In addition to the other things we're looking at, I would like to also start focusing on other aspects that the committee can focus on within the district itself, not the borough, but within the district. So if anyone can give up some ideas in regards to this, I would appreciate that. Okay, and it would be a good idea, as Taya just put into the chat, the annual fiscal report might be a good place to start, the controller's office. Other than that, I'm currently looking at the situations as far as open streets. Okay, and I think that is something that we want to take a look at too. How is that impacting the local stores, and how it's actually helping them as far as economically? Is it helping them or is it hurting them? Okay, I'd like to take a look at that as far as the restaurants also. So we'll take a look at that. And if there's any other ideas that people can come up with, currently right now, I'm working very closely with the bids, and we'll continue to work closely with the bids to see how they're doing. But for right now, I would like to see if you have any ideas whatsoever. I'm also curious about cannabis, how the cannabis laws have come into place. It's my understanding that a few of the licenses have been released, but I'm seeing a lot of storefronts that are currently selling cannabis. And I'm wondering if they're selling it legally or not, and whether or not we should do something about that, or what's the approach of handling that. So that's something else that I'm concerned about. or interested in finding out more information about. So if there's anything else anyone else can bring up, I would definitely appreciate that. Cyril, I see your hand raised because I knew I hit a topic that you're interested in.
Yeah, I think you mentioned our area, our community, the job issue. I was just wondering if, do we have, I think I asked this question before, do we have a way of measuring our, to keep a record of our joblessness and our growth or job growth in our own CB2 community, our area, so we could follow it and watch it and then figure out and point out where the needs are, or if there's any growth in some other areas, or we can find out where we can help the community in that aspect? Do we have that kind of statistics?
As a matter of fact, as I was about to answer, our board office answered also the same way. We cannot break it down to district. Okay, unfortunately, we can break it down to borough, but not to district.
And our office doesn't have the ability to do that. Our actual CB2 doesn't have the ability to do that.
No, this is from the borough office. Just mentioned it. The only way we're going to be able to do it is through census tracts that come out every 10 years.
I see.
Okay, so that's the best we can do. There's other ways of doing it that we can probably do it. We can look at numbers. We can talk. I'll talk to you about this offline. Okay, Cyril?
All right, thank you.
Okay. Anything else? Okay, so that's my chairperson's report. I'll be reaching out to all of you now that we're probably gonna have a board office that's gonna be fully staffed. Is there any other committee business that we'd like to discuss right now? Okay. Are there any individuals who would like to speak at the community forum? This is your chance. Yes, Daniel. I see you.
Is it appropriate for a journalist to ask a question? I'm a journalist and I'm working on a story about the holiday market, which is new this year at Borough Hall. And I wondered if the committee had any comment on that. If it's not appropriate to ask, that's fine.
You could comment as you wish, and if we choose to, we can respond back if it's something we can't answer.
Oh, I'm just curious if you have any views on how the holiday market's been going so far. First year at Borough Hall, that opened for about a week and a half. I was down there on Monday talking to some people, and I wondered if the committee had any views on how it's going and what its contribution can be.
My suggestion is just open and go there and purchase. You know, okay. I mean, it's their first year. By all means, anything they can do to be helped would be greatly appreciated, and will definitely benefit the small business owners who are there.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Is there any other comments from the public? Okay. With that, then I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Okay, Kate. Anyone else want a second, or we want to?
I love her. Do you?
Okay, I'll accept that. Okay, I believe that was Latrell. Okay, with that, thank you very much. This has been a very informative meeting. I wish you all a happy holiday and a safe New Year's.
Thank you.
Happy holiday to all. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you so much.